I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. It's August 25th, 2015. We're back in Atlanta with Representative Stacey Abrams, who the last time we met had reached the point where we were about to begin talking about improving our education program in Georgia, talking about transportation in Georgia, and reapportionment. Welcome once again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get into those heavy items, I would like to ask you, if you would, just to explain to us your role as minority leader of the Georgia House of Representatives.
I think the shorthand for my job is that my job is to lose well. And that means that as the minority, we're not going to win by force of numbers. So we have to either convince the other side that we're right and that they should work with us, in which case we are not going to get exactly what we ask for, or we coalition with folks who are defecting from the majority and we work together to defeat legislation we don't like. My other shorthand is that my job is to stop stupid or at least slow it down. And so the way I approach that as leader is that my first job is to collaborate, which can be counterintuitive for the opposition leader. But my fundamental belief is that Georgians don't care if I'm a Democrat or Republican, they care about their lives. And so it's our job to find ways to work together. And because I'm not going to win, I need to do my best to make sure that whatever passes is as passable and as fair to Georgians as possible. My second job is to compete, and that is to help harness my legislative caucus to offer legislation to change the things we don't like and to be competitive when we want to oppose legislation that we think is bad for Georgia. And I think the third job of the minority leader, and certainly of the minority caucus, is accountability. I am privileged to have a bully pulpit that allows me to call out things that I don't like, but also to lift up opportunities for us to work together. And if I'm doing my job well, I'm doing pretty much an even balance of the two, a little heavier sometimes on the opposition side because I want to win and I want us to be back in power. But I think that the challenge in politics is too often we think about majority-minority as an eternal conflict as opposed to opportunities for folks to move forward, and that if you do well with your progress, you will likely be rewarded by getting more power.
Your party also has a leader in the state Senate. What is your relationship with the Senate minority leader?
Steve Hinson, I think, is a solid leader and reflects the needs of his caucus. The Senate is a smaller body and it's a very different body. My job is to manage the needs of 61 members. He has 18 members. But they also have a lot more flexibility in their body when it comes to being able to amend legislation, having almost unfettered access to the floor. And so I think that we have developed a very solid working relationship where he has the ability to be more openly engaged in trying to change legislation in very critical ways, whereas I have to work to manage a larger caucus and thus a lot more interest and needs within our body.
And then I'd like to ask you this. What is the relationship of the legislative Democrats with the state Democratic Party?
It's a good one, and I'm very proud of that. I became the minority leader when DuBose Porter, who'd been both majority leader and minority leader, left to run for governor. And when I ran for leader, he was supportive of my efforts and has been supportive since I won the seat. He helped me think about how to do this job. I supported him when he ran to be the chair of the Democratic Party. And I think the role that the party plays is a very specific one, which is to be the voice of the party, to support the legislative body, but more importantly, it's to help reflect the values and push those values out. And I think under his leadership, the party's been much more aggressive about doing so.
While we're talking about party politics and party policies, let me ask you about your personal relationship with the Republican Speaker of the House, and our Republican governor.
Yes. So when I first joined the legislature, my major committee assignment was Judiciary Non-Civil, and the chair of the committee at the time was David Ralston. I will say that David Ralston was the best chair that I've ever served under. He's unabashedly conservative. He's very consistent in his ideology, but as the chair of that committee, he was always very conscientious about making certain that every member's voice was heard. You may lose in the end, but it was never going to be because you were shut out of the process, which can happen on other committees. And under his leadership, I was able firsthand to see the importance of bipartisanship. And that doesn't mean that you sublimate your beliefs or your ideology, but it does mean that you find ways to try to get the best product. And once he became speaker and a few months later I became leader, I think we've had a very solid working relationship. Part of my job is to go to him and tell him what I need for my caucus and to ask for support on some issues. And I've never been treated with anything less than great respect. But more importantly, what I appreciate about David is that when we talk, he says, hi, my friend, and he means it. And I say hello to my friend, and I mean it. I think that we have been well served by his tenure as speaker. I certainly would like our party to be in charge, but if I can't be in charge, he's a good guy to have there. Mm-hmm. I think Governor Deal has been a thoughtful leader in ways that many of us didn't expect. There was a part of his tenure as a congressman that led many to have pause about what type of governor he would be. What I have found is that he's someone who is genuinely interested in improving the state. We disagree about what that looks like, most recently on the issue of opportunity school districts. But I have been proud to stand with him on issues of criminal justice reform, on helping move pre-K forward. And even when we didn't agree wholly on an approach such as the Hope Scholarship, I appreciated the honesty with which he dealt with me and his willingness, again, to get the best result and to share the credit, which he doesn't have to do.
Let's talk for a minute about the changes in the Hope Scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
Explain that process to us, please.
In 2011, when Governor Deal became governor and during my first session as leader, we were told by the actuaries who managed the scholarship that it was going to be bankrupt by 2015, and this is back in 2010. There was the need for critical action. As Democrats and certainly as the progenitors of the Hope Scholarship, there was a strong belief that the scholarship should be needs-based, not merit-based. But that ship had sailed under both Democratic and Republican leadership. We had essentially eliminated the needs-based portion of the scholarship. And so what we faced was a wholesale change in how much money would be allocated under a merit system. And my worry was that if we said our way or no way, we were going to be left out of the conversation. I was invited to have a discussion with the governor's team, and in that process, I raised three key issues. One was the need to make sure that we retained remedial coursework in technical colleges, because many of the families sending kids back to school or the adults who were returning to technical college, they needed remedial courses. If you hadn't taken algebra since 8th grade, you were going to need that course. And if you couldn't have that course, if you couldn't have the Hope Scholarship pay for that remedial course, you would never qualify for the Hope Scholarship, and you likely would leave and never come back. The second issue was one of proprietary schools. These are the for-profit schools, which nationally have a mixed reputation, but in Georgia, there were a handful of them that had been part of the Hope Scholarship process and therefore had been elevated in terms of their deliverables. They do a good job of serving our students, and the original proposition would have eliminated them from receiving the Hope Grant. And the third was that for kids who would lose the Hope Scholarship, particularly those who needed the aid, not based on merit, but based on financial need, there was no alternative. Georgia does not have a robust needs-based system. And if they lost the Hope Scholarship, they were likely going to have to leave school. And this was particularly true in poor communities and in rural communities. And so I requested from the governor, in exchange for support of the larger macro changes, that we retain funding for remedial courses, that we retain access for proprietary schools, and that we fund this needs-based, basically a 1% interest loan program, which fully funded for the first time this low interest loan. In addition, after some debate, we were able to also negotiate return to a full funding of pre-K, which had been temporarily taken out of the equation, or actually had been cut under the governor's proposal. And after some negotiation, we were able to get that restored. And in exchange, I stood with the governor because I believe on the whole, while it did reduce access to the Hope Scholarship in terms of full funding, I think overall it provided the largest breadth of support that kids needed and that students needed in the state to continue to move forward.
So you are satisfied with the changes?
I am satisfied with the changes we were able to negotiate. Certainly if Democrats were in charge, if I'd been in charge, I would have reflected much more a belief that this should be a needs-based scholarship, that we are spending millions of dollars on kids who have other means to attend college and would make the same exact choices irrespective of access. But that wasn't the choice offered. And more than anything, I'm a pragmatist. I think you meet people in situations where they are not where you want them to be. And so with that as the frame, yes, I'm very satisfied.
So we can be assured that the program will continue into the future?
It's been stabilized. It's actually been doing very well. And the other piece that I think has been critical, once I negotiated that with the governor's office and once we were able to make those changes, I also asked Stacey Abrams, who is one of our representatives, was one of the first recipients of a Hope Scholarship, as Stacey to take the lead on really looking at what the implications would be on the technical college side. And she has since that time been incredibly successful working with the governor's folks and with our caucus to make changes that have been important improvements to the Hope Scholarship, and particularly the Hope Grant, which focuses on technical colleges. And that, I think, goes back to the point I was making earlier, that part of our job is to collaborate, and we did that on the Hope Scholarship, but the other part of the job is competition and pushing for better ideas, and we've continued to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, education, transportation, and health care are subjects that are most always on the minds of Georgia voters.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about those issues. First of all, education. What is your main concern about education in Georgia's public schools today?
We do not provide adequate resources for the needs of the children we serve. And what that means is that poor children, whether they are poor because of whether they're urban poor or rural poor, it is more expensive to educate those children. It's more expensive to educate children with special needs. But if you under-resource the education of a child, there's no attrition that allows you to catch up later on. When a child doesn't learn to read by third grade, when a child is denied access to services, there isn't the ability to ameliorate that impact. And we can't afford not to fully fund. And that full funding isn't just a formula that says here it cost $8,310, and I'm making that number up, to educate a child. It's what does that child need? Does that child need access to food? Does that child need to have their eyes checked because their parents can't afford to take them to the doctor? Does that child have the resources at home? If we put all of their coursework online, do they have the internet at home? Can they do the research they need to do? Do they come from a family that is literate, so that when they go home, someone can help read to that child to improve their vocabulary, or are you sending the child home to essentially lose a day's worth of schooling? Those resources have to be provided through the public school system because we have to, again, meet children where they are. And we are not adequately funding those needs right now.
Mm-hmm. We hear a lot about charter schools and magnet schools. What are the difference between those two schools? And what is the difference between a charter school and a magnet school and a traditional public school?
Traditional public school, typically in Georgia, are neighborhood-based schools that provide support and education to children and get their funding and their management from a school district. Magnet schools are schools that are within the public school system that have traditionally been given special permission to focus on an area of achievement, and children from other places beyond the neighborhood are allowed to apply to attend those schools. But they are managed and operated just like other public schools. They simply have a more rarefied approach. Charter schools are a different animal in that they are public schools, but they're public schools that have an independent management system that is typically separate from the school district. They are given the ability to essentially elude some of the requirements and restrictions that are placed on traditional public schools in exchange for having, in theory, better outcomes. Charter schools began as an experiment to see that if you removed and relieved some of the restrictions and some of the administrative requirements, would you get a better outcome? And the reality is, it depends. And the debate that we're having, I think, is an important debate, but it's also a distracting debate. Charter schools aren't good or bad. They are not a panacea to the educational woes of the Georgia system, and they are not an evil. What they are, they're an alternative that in some communities work better because they're able to concentrate resources and aggregate support. And in other places, they are dismal failure because they perform not only not better than the traditional public school, but actually underperform. And the worry I have is that with any school that does not perform at the level it should, the child who's the customer does not have the ability to go back and get that service again.
How many of those schools do we have in Georgia, non-traditional schools?
I cannot give you the exact number, but I think charter schools, the last count, served maybe 2 to 3% of the student population in Georgia.
And how are they funded?
They used to be funded primarily through outside support, and that was one of the pieces of the compact. The compact, when charter schools started, was you raise your resources. In exchange for we put in less money, but we're going to have not less expectation of you, but we are going to give you fewer restrictions because you raise your resources, you develop your process, and in exchange, we will alleviate some of the restrictions on you, but you're not going to get as much support. Unfortunately, over the last few years, we've shifted to a model that says you still get to be exempt from certain responsibilities, but we're going to treat you exactly the way we treat traditional public schools. And the problem with that is that you're creating an unfair set of competition because one school has restrictions placed on it, limits on its funding, and expectations that are identical to a school that's been told you don't have to follow the rules, but we're going to give you the same amount of money. And then we try to put them head to head and say, why is one doing better than the other? Well, if someone told me I get to pick my customers and I get to get as much money as I want to pay for the outcomes, and the other side has to take exactly what's sent and have very heavy restrictions on what they can do, you're going to see a disparity in outcome. And so the challenge with charter schools is that they're given more freedom and more flexibility, but we're paying for it whether they deliver or not.
Who can attend charter schools?
Charter schools are determined typically by attendance zones, some by lotteries, but they can also place restrictions on who comes in. The challenge, particularly with charter schools, are their expulsion policies, not their admission policies. Because even if they let a child in, unlike a traditional public school, charter schools have the ability to expel children, suspend children, remove them from service. And those are things that public schools, traditional public schools, can't do. They have to serve all comers.
Are those charter school students held to the same standards and requirements as a traditional school?
They are held to the same standards and requirements, but they are not held to the same restrictions on how those standards and requirements are met. And so child A and child B can be forced to take the same test or can be compelled to take the same test. But the challenge is that if child B underperforms in a way that the charter school doesn't like, the charter school has the ability to simply not allow that student to return, which means that you can remove those who are changing the makeup of the school that you want. But the child in the traditional public school, the school, with very few exceptions, has to retain that child. Now, the reality is there are charter schools that do extraordinary work. Drew Charter School used to be in my district until redistricting. Drew Charter School has made extraordinary advances in the way they serve children. However, we also have to remember that a multi-million-dollar wholesale change of a community also occurred around that school. And so the resources were not just put in place for the school, but the resources were put in place for the entire community. There are other charter schools that have done extraordinarily well, but the question I always have is, how many children were admitted to that school? How many children were removed from that school? and what were the resources that were available to the kids that didn't get into that school. And those are not questions we get to ask for traditional public schools, and therefore the comparative, I think, is often unfair.
Okay. Who decides what schools become charter schools?
So prior to 2012, charter schools were determined solely by local school districts. Local school districts received applications from parents or community groups or outside entities saying that they wanted to create a charter school. They submitted an application, the school board reviewed the application, and it was up to the school board to determine whether or not a charter school would be chartered. After the 2012 constitutional amendment, 1162, we changed the system to create a state charter commission. Again, I support charter schools in the abstract and often in reality. I strongly opposed the constitutional amendment because what we said was we're going to take that responsibility from the local school districts and give it to a state charter commission. The commission is appointed entirely by the governor, and the challenge is that we have aggregated in the hands of the governor, not the school board, not the school superintendent who we elect, but the governor and his appointed school board. They get to determine with the charter commission which schools are chartered or not under the state charter. So a local school district can refuse a charter. That charter can then be submitted to the state charter commission, and even though the local community may have said, for these reasons we believe the school is not valid, the state can supersede that responsibility and then put that school in place. I do not believe that we should circumvent local decision making when it comes to access to resources and to the placement of schools.
Now, is a charter school charter district-wide, or is that just for one particular school?
They tend to be by attendance zones. So a charter school will say that here's the group of kids who can apply to attend the schools.
Common Core.
Yes. I believe that Common Core makes sense. I think that it should not matter where you grow up. The Constitution is the Constitution in all 50 states, and 4 + 4 = 8 no matter where you are. I think that we have become so focused on the theme of local control that we've forgotten that knowledge is universal. I'm a very strong proponent of local control when it comes to administration, because the closer you are to the people, I think the better you are able to understand the needs. But the core of education, the common core of education, does not change based on your geography. And I approve of Common Core because what it says is that no matter where you live, what you learn should be the same. And I think that is too often conflated with this idea of local administration, and those are not the same things.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell us about the plan to create a statewide school district that will give the governor the power to take over what are called failing schools.
Opportunity school districts will be on the ballot in 2016. I strongly opposed the creation of this opportunity school district for the same reason that I had concerns about the Charter Commission. We are aggregating power regarding education into the hands of the governor. And while I have the greatest respect for our current governor, I don't know who his successor is going to be. And the extent to which we make decisions based on the personality of one politician or the intent of one politician, but fundamentally change the constitution of our state, that is deeply problematic. The other challenge I have is that the Opportunity School District will allow a single person to have authority over the operation of those schools through the Opportunity School District Director. That person will be appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate, but if that person fails, the Senate has no control and no ability to remove that person. The House has no say in the entire process. And what that means is that you are essentially aggregating control over up to 140 schools. Actually, I think only 100 can be in the district at any one time. But those schools can be managed and controlled by a person who is not answerable to the citizens of Georgia, because the Opportunity School District Director does not report to the school superintendent, does not report to the school board. That person reports to the governor. In every other state that has taken on this approach, an elected body had the authority to remove that person. This will be the first time that that power is aggregated in one person. in the form of a governor. The other challenge is that we have not, with this constitutional amendment, also agreed to resource these schools appropriately. So what you create is an opportunity to take a school, to call it failing, to remove it from the operational control of the community for 10 years, and failure to actually appropriately support that school has no consequence, because it is entirely the authority of the governor to decide whether that school is in that district or not. And so if a school leaves the school district and is not made better, there's no consequence. There's no recourse that a family or community can take.
Well, who will define a failing school, and what is a failing school?
A failing school will be defined by legislation. So this year, our definition is a failing school is a school that's failed to meet adequate yearly progress, and there's a new acronym for it, but essentially has failed to meet the federal standards as adopted by the state for 3 years. Now, the challenge there is that it also, let's frame it this way. There are school districts where you have a child who comes in who's reading at a 3rd grade level and is in the 5th grade. If a teacher in the school manages to move that child from 3rd grade to the 4th grade in that school year, but that child does not test at the 5th grade level because the teachers could not move them two grades, but could move them an entire school grade, that school is still considered failing. So irrespective of what the child knew when the child got there, progress is not an inherent part of the equation. Now, we were able, in the legislation that passed, we were able to get language placed that said that that should be part of the dynamic and part of the equation, but there's nothing to say that that can't be stripped out by a successor legislator. And so the challenge I have is that we are placing in the Constitution an authority that we will never again, or we will be unlikely to limit in any reasonable fashion.
So we'll vote on that.
We will vote on that in November 2016.
And if it passes, it goes into effect
in 17.
17. Will that replace the current State Board of Education?
It will not. So this will only apply to schools that fall into this category. And it will be, but the reality is, and this is the other kicker, no matter which school is placed into that category, they don't get extra money. They get the same, they basically take the money that they were already getting from the school district. Now, we may decide as a legislature to add additional resources. We don't know, because we're still going through the Ed Reform Commission process, which was my other concern about passing this. We've passed a bill that says we need to do more, but we refuse to say how we plan to pay for it. And typically when you don't know how you're going to pay for something when you buy it, you don't plan to pay for it. And so my worry is that we are creating new responsibilities without creating adequate resources, so we're simply shifting the deck chairs. Because if these children are truly in danger, then our first priority should be to tell them how much we're willing to invest in fixing it, and then we figure out what the mechanism is, as opposed to doing it in reverse, which is what we've done.
So we will be wrong in assuming that the implementation of this new plan will mean more funding for education.
Absolutely. There is nothing in the legislation or in the constitutional amendment that assures that additional resources will follow.
Okay. We know that Georgia is a red state, meaning it is strongly Republican. We voted Republican in, 11 of the last 14 elections for president. We have seen our state legislature turn totally Republican. What is your opinion on how that can be changed?
First, I reject the premise that we are strongly Republican. We were. There was an inflection point where the state was strongly Republican, but that has been diminishing over time. And I think what we tend to forget is, just as it took some time for us to reach that inflection point, it will take some time for us to reach the point of diminution. At its peak, Democrats were losing elections by 400, 500,000 votes. Where we are now is it's under 200,000. That's a fairly dramatic dip in less than a decade. And what that signals is that the demography of the state is changing, but so too are the ideological beliefs. because Georgia's population shift is not simply one of racial demography, it's also one of ideological difference between progressives and conservatives who are moving into the state. And so the challenge is, how do you harness those changes if you're a Democrat, and how do you forestall those changes if you're a Republican? So I see on the Democratic side of the aisle, the goal is to continue to articulate what our beliefs are, but also to demonstrate why the other side is not meeting the challenges and the needs of the community. And as with any product that you're selling, it's not enough to say that the other guy's bad. You have to say why you're better. And so the mission I see for Democrats is that we can't simply keep pointing and yelling and saying, well, we don't like. We have to say, and here's what you'd get, here's what you'd get. And that really is the mission that I have as minority leader and as a leader in my party. I think that what we saw in the 2014 election was that that was a competitive race in a time and in a state where it shouldn't have been competitive. And it was not a cakewalk. Although David Perdue certainly won by a fairly sizable margin within the universe, he only won by 200,000 votes. And in a state with 10 million people, with 800,000 unregistered people of color, with more than 700,000 drop-off voters, meaning people who will vote in presidential but not non-presidential years, if I'm on the other side of the aisle, I'm a little concerned, because if Democrats figure out the alchemy to turn out those voters and to register those voters, the numbers change. Now, the reality is, on both of those equations, Republicans can do the same thing. Republicans can register voters, Democrats can register voters. In Georgia, registration is nonpartisan. And nonpartisan registration means it doesn't matter what you believe when you register. What matters is getting them on the rolls, and then it's up to the parties to go after those voters and convince them that their theory of the case is correct. And so my belief is that our fundamental public policy responsibility is voter registration. Whether you're Democrat or Republican, we need to make certain that as many of our citizens are engaged in the operation of their state as possible. Governor Deal actually once made a comment about the fact that 56% of the students in our public school system are children of color, but their parents don't comprise 56% of our voters, which means that you have people making choices for children who may not have those children's best interest at heart. I share his concern, and I believe that when Republicans go out and register voters, when Democrats do it, when nonpartisan groups do it, that all of us are working toward the same end, which is to lift voter registration and to lift the voices of those folks. Now, once they're all registered, the second job is how do you get them to be engaged and turn out, and that's the partisan part. And on that side of the equation, I think Democrats have to do an increasingly aggressive job of meeting voters, talking to them, making certain that they understand what's at stake, but also that they trust that we would do a better job than the other side. And I think that there are legitimate critiques about how effective Democrats have been at that. There are years where we were extraordinary, and there are years where we were no different than the other side. And there's no reason to change a product if you're going to get the same results. Might as well stick with what you know. And so Democrats have to be able to show that we're going to be different and we're going to be better.
You have been in the forefront of voter registration in recent years. You think that you've been successful?
Absolutely. I come from a family that believes very strongly in the Voting Rights Act. My father was 15 when he helped to integrate and to get folks the right to vote in Mississippi. And he did that knowing that he would not actually be old enough to vote for several years, because the right to vote was so fundamental and so crucial. The work that I've done through the New Georgia Project was done through a nonprofit that I started back when I was in law school. And I've used it for other projects. In this past election year, I used it for voter registration because I became very concerned through the last few years I've served in the legislature at how many people simply aren't engaged. And in a 6-month period in 2014, we registered more than 86,000 people. Only 46,000 of them actually made it onto the rolls, which means that we have to do a better job as a state of making sure that every application is efficiently and effectively processed. And while I'm very pleased by that, that's 10% of what needs to be done. There are a total of 800,000, so we're down to about 750,000 folks, and that's assuming no one new shows up. So that's a lot of folks who need to be registered, and that's a lot of work that has to be done. But any progress that we make, every person who gets access to the franchise, who feels more emboldened about being able to participate in the body politic, that's an improvement, and that's an important task.
Let's talk about reapportionment.
Yes.
reapportionment is very important to the makeup of Georgia government, particularly your state House of Representatives and your state Senate. I have heard you voice opinion on reapportionment. Tell us what you really think.
I became the leader November of 2010, and in August of 2011, I had my first encounter with reapportionment. I framed it at the time and continue to believe it to be so, that we engaged in resegregation in 2010 and 2011, and here's why. We targeted white women, and when I say we, I mean the body, because eventually the maps that were adopted, targeted white women Democrats who represented majority minority districts. I don't care what the race of the person is. If you are targeting someone for defeat based on their race, that is problematic and should not be allowed. We packed African Americans into districts. My district went from being in the low 50s with African American makeup to 63%. I don't want to be in a district where I am supposed to be assured of my win because of my race. I should have to compete for every vote, and I should have to satisfy the needs of my entire constituency and not just the ones who look like me. We also managed, I think, unfortunately, to constrain where Latinos were able to aggregate their power, and then we cut off in too many places the ability of the Asian American population, which is growing, to effectively coalition, because they're too small right now to have a full district, but they should be able to influence elections, and they can't right now because of how we've drawn the lines. My belief is that Georgia was actually doing well under the Voting Rights Act because we had whites who represented districts of color, we had African Americans and Latinos who represented majority white districts. That's what we should do. That's what we should be moving towards. And unfortunately, the way the districts were drawn in 2011, they were designed to disrupt that. I am pleased that in 2012, despite our inability to stop those maps, we were able to thwart some of their impact. And so the two critical examples for me are that in one district where we had a Latino, the only Latino Democrat was drawn into a majority Republican, majority white district, we were able to hold his seat. We were able to hold a seat in middle Georgia down in Troup County and Coweta County, which was drawn to be majority white. We were actually able to hold that with an African American candidate. And in Douglasville-Paulding County, which was drawn to be a majority Republican seat, we actually picked that seat up with an African American woman. And what that signaled to me was not the success of people of color to win these seats, but it was the success of an argument that said that representation should be reflective of the needs of the community. We also retained a majority Republican seat with a white member. And I take great pride in the fact that we have the most diverse caucus in the state, and that diversity reflects the makeup of our state. 2014, we were one of the few chambers in the country not to lose a single seat in competitive elections. And a few weeks ago, we actually picked up a seat, and we are now at 61, which, out of 180 seems like a small number, but when you can win a Republican seat as a Democrat, especially in an area like Brookhaven, that is something to be noted. My belief is that reapportionment should not be an opportunity for resegregation, and it should also not be retaliation. It should be reflective of the needs of a community, and there's no more acute an example than Gwinnett County, which is a majority minority county that still has a majority conservative white majority. That does not reflect the needs. If you are Cambodian, if you are Korean, if you are Haitian, you should have a voice in your community, because the state legislature that draws those lines for themselves also draw the lines for the county commission and for your school board and for your city council. And I am challenged every time we make choices based on our political outcomes and not based on the needs of the people that we stand for.
Mm-hmm. On January 1st of this year, there was a bill introduced into the state Senate to create a redistricting commission. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think redistricting commissions are a good idea. Do I see it ever passing in the state of Georgia? It is unlikely. Mm-hmm. In the states where redistricting commissions have generally been adopted, it's been adopted by the vote of the people through public referenda. Georgia does not allow that. And so we're instead asking we're asking the very beneficiaries of our rigged system to unrig the system. And I am dubious that we will ever be able to get a majority of our fellow legislators to agree to put their jobs at risk. But I think it's a good idea that we do so.
So what we're going to see is this continuation of the fox guarding the chicken house, so to speak. As long as you have a majority as large as the Republican Party has in Georgia today, you're going to continue to see those types of districts.
You will see them unless we can effectively leverage the current maps to bring more parity by 2020. And that's my mission as leader. It's been a bit of a slow going, but technically under the maps that were adopted in 2010 or 2011, there are 124 Republican seats and only 56 Democratic seats. Yet Democrats hold 61 of those seats. What that signals is that Democrats can win in these districts. We win because we are paying very close attention to, again, the demography of those districts, not just meaning the racial demographic, but also the ideological demographic. So we're picking up seats in communities where people may not expect to see us. And we will continue to do that. In order to draw themselves 124 seats to give themselves a supermajority, the Republicans drew a number of districts that have very narrow margins of 5, 7, 8 points. In 2010, 2011, changing that was difficult, but by 2020, it becomes increasingly easy to take some of those districts back simply because the numbers do not allow for a static read of those maps. And my belief is, and my theory is, that the more we can aggressively attack in those districts, the more we can be very vocal in our beliefs and we can promote good candidates, the more of those seats we'll win. We probably won't take the majority by 2020, but if we're close enough for horseshoes, then we can have, I think, an important voice in the redistricting process. And if we've won the governorship in 2018, then there's a lot more negotiation that I think is on parity with where Georgia's going to be. Because the reality is, as much as I want us to be a blue state, Georgia's not going to be a blue state anytime soon. We're going to be a purple state. And that purple state will happen for probably another 10 years. So let's assume our tipping point is 2018. We'll continue to be purple through probably 2030 because we still have very strong conservative and very strong progressive beliefs. The question is, those in the middle, which way do they swing? And we're going to have to, both parties, work on convincing folks to go our way. But I believe in my party, and I believe that my party will make the best argument, and it will be most reflective of the changing demography of the state, and we will eventually win, but it's going to take some time.
Mm-hmm. Now, a word or two about transportation.
Yes.
It seems to me that Georgia has never had a coherent transportation plan. Have I missed something?
Georgia has created, I think for the first time, the commoditization of transportation. So we have decided as a state that that's one of our goods. If you look at what we do in Savannah, if you look at Atlanta, if you look at the interstate system that we have. The problem is, for all of our talk about running government like a business, we are a business that has created a product that we don't understand, don't know how to sell, and under support. And so I think you're right. The coherence of our strategy leaves a great bit to be desired because we don't seem to recognize what we've done. We're like the dogs that caught the car, and we don't know that we need to either let go or learn how to drive. And so I think that the challenge for Georgia is that we have to recognize, if we want to offer transportation as our commodity, which we do when we bring things into the Savannah port, it is because we say that we can transport your goods better than anyone else, bring them here. When you place the Atlanta airport where we've placed it, we're saying we can bring your goods and services and your people in and out as quickly as possible. When we recruit businesses and say you can go down to Savannah, or you can go up to Athens, you can go over to Columbus, when we say that, when we ask for the retention of the bases that we have in the state, we have to be able to argue that we can move you around the state. And so the coherence of our transportation policy has to take into account the range of transportation options. In Atlanta, that means paying attention to public transit. We are a dense, heavily packed region that requires alternative means of transportation besides cars and buses. And if we ever want to be able to call ourselves a state that has a coherent transportation system, we also have to recognize that you should be able to leave Atlanta and get somewhere else, and that means we've got to pay more attention to passenger rail. We have to be willing to recognize that we've made it a core of who we are, but that then means we have to be willing to pay for it, and that's really the fundamental flaw, because it's not only a poor strategy, it's a poor resourcing of that flawed strategy.
A new $1 billion appropriation that taxpayers will have already begun divvying up for road improvement in Georgia. Is that designed to be a stopgap measure to feed political fodder to local voters, or is that a genuine step toward improving transportation in Georgia?
I think it is a genuine step towards improving transportation, and here's why. The voters don't actually want us to raise their taxes. We have done a very good job as politicians of convincing people that they should get stuff they shouldn't pay for, which is all that taxes are. Taxes are paying for the things you want. And we have made it a gospel that you shouldn't have to pay for it. What we've realized with transportation is we've reached the place where we have to actually fund it, and I think that it was a courageous step by many of our members to agree to pay for it. The problem was we made a very, it was a poor mouth approach to it. It's not all we need, but it was the most we were going to get for now, because the real need is closer to $3 billion a year, and we're going to generate a little under $1 billion a year. That said, it is an important first step because we've broken through that impenetrable barrier that says that we can't talk about how much things cost and that people have to pay for it. And for a conservative majority that is told that it is anathema to ever say that a tax is a good tax, we've been willing to do that, and I give great credit for that. I think the next step, though, is to figure out where the other $2 billion come from. The other piece that I was very pleased about in this that shows actual progress as opposed to appeasement is that we are spending money on transit. And that is a third rail in Georgia, no pun intended, that has been very difficult to talk about. And I think for the first time, we're willing to not only talk about it, but we're willing to resource it, and that's progress.
Good. Now, the question of mass transit in Atlanta.
Yes.
What chances does the city of Atlanta have to get support for some modern system of mass transit from the General Assembly?
The 2015 Transportation Plan recognizes the value of MARTA. It also recognizes that whether MARTA began as an Atlanta entity, it is now a regional requirement. When Mercedes decides where it's going to locate based on its proximity to MARTA, when companies move from outside the perimeter inside because they need to get closer to a MARTA station, we have to start believing and admitting as a state body that MARTA is not simply an Atlanta entity and therefore deserves statewide support. From its inception, Fulton County, DeKalb County have had skin in the game, and now Clayton County does. But the challenge is making sure that we not only modernize it, but that we fully resource it. I was recently in Toronto where we talked about the need for public transit and how much Toronto is willing to invest. I think they're doing a $3 billion investment, and we squabble over a few $100 million every year. But what was incredibly enlightening, and I think enlightening for all of us who were there, was to hear about just how well regarded MARTA is. We have a great deal of public disdain for MARTA, but by national comparative, MARTA has done some exceptional things and has made great progress. But more than that, it's done so with very strong resource constraints and therefore gets, I think, even higher marks of what we've accomplished. I'm proud of the legislature for agreeing for the first time since the 1970s to lift the handcuffs and let MARTA actually operate like a full-fledged business. But we've got a lot more to do, and that means more than just letting them spend their own money. We as a state have to continue to invest.
Georgia falls into the category of being one of those states whose residents are most in need of Medicaid services. And yet the state has refused to expand the program. Why?
Our refusal to expand Medicaid is entirely grounded in flawed math and ideological idiocy is a strong word, but it is a poor choice. And I say that I'm going to go ahead and claim idiocy, because what we're saying is we're willing to reject $30 billion and 70,000 jobs purely out of animus for the author of the legislation. There have been arguments that Medicaid expansion would cost Georgia money, but by independent estimates, it's $200 million extra a year, which may sound like a lot until you consider the fact that we have a $21 billion budget, and that the cost right now that we invest, the monies that we have to pay for uncompensated care, far exceed that $200 million. It's just not written as a single check. Instead, it's the moral equivalent. I think Don Balfour has said this before, although he didn't necessarily say it about Medicaid expansion. He said it about healthcare and CON, but I'll use it here. It's as though someone walked into Waffle House and said, I want you to feed me everything on your menu, but I don't plan to pay for it, and then leaves and comes back every single day doing that. And then someone else says, well, okay, we're willing to give you a credit card to cover that guy's cost. You're going to have to put a little money in, but we'll cover it. We say no, because we think it's going to cost, our interest rate's going to be a little bit on this credit card, and we're ignoring the interest rate on the credit card in lieu of how much we lose every day. So we lose $10 a day because we don't want to pay $1 on the credit card bill. That makes no sense. It is economically inefficient. But the secondary challenge is that there are thousands of jobs that are going to be lost in communities where we haven't expanded Medicaid. And if we were to expand it, 70,000 jobs would be created across the state. We get excited when a company comes in and agrees to give us 300 jobs, and we end up paying, $25,000 per job. The cost per job would be probably closer to $5,000 per job and that's assuming that you don't count the ancillary tax benefit that comes in, which could be close to $25 billion. There is an economic reason for it, but there's also a moral reason. We have 430 plus thousand people who are being denied access to health care, not because we can't afford it, but because we don't want to do it. Those are families, those are parents, those are people who are working, who need access to health care. Those are 25,000 veterans who served our country that we're saying no to. And it is an immoral choice for us to make. It is an economically inefficient choice for us to make. And it is an idiotic rejection of funds that we could be using to improve the state today.
Governor Deal made that decision, and then he passed it along to the General Assembly. Is there any hope that in the future the General Assembly might reconsider?
I think there's always hope. I think hope tends to come about, or hope tends to turn into action when hope meets failure. And I think what's about to happen is that we have rural hospitals throughout the state that are on the brink of collapse, that with an infusion of capital that comes with Medicaid expansion could not only survive but thrive. And those hospitals employ up to 30% of a community. So you're not just talking about the collapse of a hospital, you're talking about the collapse of counties, of communities. And I think the first time a legislator lives in one of those communities and it collapses, but also that the citizens in that community understand whose fault it is, that's when you'll start to see change. And that goes back to the fundamental question of voter registration and voter engagement. Hospital usage isn't Democratic or Republican, it's Georgian. And so every Georgian needs to be registered, so every Georgian understands who to hold accountable when their hospital collapses and they lose their jobs. Because it's not just the hospitals that leave. Then all of the restaurants that support those hospitals have to shut down. And all of the ancillary companies that support who, where you bought your car and where you live, all of those things fall like dominoes. and the state legislator who represented that district and refused those dollars should be held personally accountable for that decision.
Give me your wish list
For
legislation.
I want Medicaid expansion. I want full funding of education, and by full funding, funding formulas that are based on the actual needs of children and not an aggregation of the least amount that we can invest. I would love to see us make healthy transportation investments that exceed our current investment. I think the $900 million was a great start, but we need to fully fund what we put into not only transit, but into passenger rail. And something we don't talk about as often, we have to start funding infrastructure. Transportation is one part of infrastructure, but Georgia has an inordinate number of communities that are still not connected to broadband, to natural gas, to septic, to our water sewer systems. They are basically standalone entities that cannot fully engage and fully leverage what it means to be a Georgian. And if you're a child growing up in one of those households where you can't go on the internet and get information, where you can't apply for a job because the library shut down and all of the job applications are on the internet, if you're a 26-year-old, where you have one bad week and you are out of water for the next few months because you can't afford to pay your bill. Those are terrible choices for us to make. And if we were willing to have a 21st century investment in infrastructure in Georgia, we would make dramatic strides as a state.
Good. Any new books?
Well, I have one that I'm trying to finish up. I've actually been working on it for a few years. I got a little bit distracted by becoming minority leader, so I haven't had as much time to write as I used to, but I'm working on it and hopefully we'll have it finished this summer.
Good. So, in a nutshell, tell us your future plans.
My future plan immediately is to grow the Democratic caucus, to situate us so that we have a strong impact every day on legislation, and long term that we are able to be competitive and engaged in the redistricting process. That's my first and foremost responsibility. There are certainly other jobs I'd like to have, but I can't think of any of those until I've done the job that I've been hired to do.
Not looking at West Paces Ferry Road?
I think it's always nice to look at West Paces Ferry Road.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a delight.